members at the 1 o'clock luncheon suspension. This Parliament was at that time considering for second reading and the committal a bill for an act to provide for the establishment of a body corporate to be known as the Clfton Heritage Authority, to have responsibility for owning, managing, and preserving that area known as Clfton Heritage as a national park and historical site, and for matters incidental. At the luncheon suspension, the Honourable Member for Mount Moriah indicated his willingness to make his contribution at that time. You may now do so if you wish, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have been encouraged to be as brief as I can, and I will make every attempt to do that. But I believe history will not treat me kindly if I move too fast and miss something that is important to be pressed forever into the annals of this honourable House. If it pleases you, Mr. Speaker. I first, Mr. Speaker, wish to give thanks. Thanks to the Almighty God for the people of the Mount Moriah constituency who gave me this opportunity to bear witness to the fact that God is real, that He is in control. He can rise you up, He can pull you down at will. I know now more than ever before that if you trust in God and not lean unto your own understanding, He will bring you through any and all trials and tribulations. Today, Mr. Speaker, we're here for the second reading of a bill for an act to provide for the establishment of a body corporate to be known as the Clfton Heritage Authority, to have responsibility for owning, managing, and preserving that area known as Clfton Heritage as a national park and historical site, and for matters incidental. The F&M administration, Mr. Speaker, was pulled down from power because they tried to destroy Clifton and corruptively tried to benefit financially from the blood, sweat, tears, and burial remains of our African ancestors, whose resilience, supported by their belief in God, brought them through the greatest Holocaust that humanity ever had seen. All of us in this country, are the beneficiaries of their sacrifice. Taking my lead, Mr. Speaker, from the Bible book of Isaiah chapter 6, I want to express how humbled I am at God's awesomeness, that He has given me this opportunity to experience great joy and tremendous honor to be the most qualified person in this assembly to address all matters concerning this bill which I support. With that being the case, I wish to, and do so hereby assert, that the purpose and intention of this bill must never be considered unless reference is made to this contribution today. Mr. Speaker, it is my intention to reflect the views of those who fought long and hard to cause this bill to be before this assembly. I submit to you, sir, that without such input, we will never know the true feelings of the people whose courage we can now all stand in victory of having stopped the destruction of Clifton by the multinational multi-millions. Naturally, if the views of the masses are seen as being reflected in the intention of this bill, immortalized in the pages of the records of this honorable assembly, then we would have begun a new day in our Commonwealth, the day when the voice of the people tower far above the will and selfish interests of the executive, the F&M executive, and its plutocratic parasites. Mr. Speaker, today I feel invigorated and exhilarated that I am venturing into the last mile of the journey to Save Clifton. Sometime in late 1997, would-be developers named Chapman and Light Associates submitted a proposal to the F&M administration to develop a housing community at the southwestern end of the island of New Providence on some 600 acres of contiguous land. This acreage, Mr. Speaker, comprised of 4 pieces of property, totaling some 1,239 acres, the title of which goes back to Crown grants of the late 1780s. The original grants, Mr. Speaker, included 150 acres originally granted to Mr. Thomas Ross, 190 acres originally granted to Mr. Lewis Johnston, 451 acres originally granted to John Wood, and 448 acres originally granted to William Lightfoot. Yes, Mr. Speaker, Lightfoot Key, as we know today, is a part of the Clfton plantation. Mr. Speaker, by virtue of a declaration of vesting on the 19th of January 1989, the Bahamas government acquired 208.41 acres of the Clfton plantation pursuant to the Acquisition of Land Act 1913. Then it was recorded as Chapter 233 of the Statute Laws of the Bahamas, and I believe now it is 252 of the current laws. And they had acquired it for the public purpose of constructing a port terminal as defined in the Section 2D of that Act. Today, Mr. Speaker, this bill draws our focus to this 208.41 acres, which is being referred to as the Clfton heritage by this bill before us. I want to make it clear that from the 19th of January 1989, the Clfton heritage, that is this 208 acres of land, was owned by the Bahamian people, and it still is owned by the Bahamian people. It never, ever transferred title to anyone else. The basic rule of law in this regard is that if government takes your land for a public purpose under this Act, you have only a constitutional right to claim compensation for it. But once your land is acquired and vested in the treasury of the Bahamas, that's it. Your land is gone forever. You are only entitled to compensation under Article 27. In the year 2000, the F&M administration had at least 10 lawyers, Mr. Speaker, in their ranks in this House and in Senate. And about at least 6 of them were serving at the executive level at the time. Interestingly, our Governor General at the time was also an attorney, and who was the father of one of those ministers who was pushing actually for the gated community to be developed at Clfton. Now, at that time, at the time of acquiring the Clfton heritage, the PLP administration did not pay for the land because it was not clear, Mr. Speaker, to whom the monies were supposed to be paid. A quiet action had commenced in the Supreme Court in 1981. This matter was not finally determined by the Supreme Court until the 4th of February in the year 2000. In the case where it was known who the owner was, but no money was paid, then the major question, which was during the Clfton fight, and maybe even still is now, is whether the land automatically went back to the person who owned it just before the acquisition. I would say very, very assuredly that the answer is no. It does not go back. When we look at the Acquisition of Land Act and Article 27, as I've already indicated, the person is only entitled to being compensated for the land which had been taken. It is suggested, by virtue of what has been submitted to the Supreme Court of the Bahamas, that there were a number of other subsequent conveyances of the title in this piece of land. However, I am not willing, on the basis of what I have seen and what I know, to concede that what was advanced for and on behalf of the parties to the action before the Supreme Court is without any serious reservation. These are things that really make you wonder. And so the song says, I think it makes you go, and think long and hard. Suffice to say, however, Her Ladyship Chief Justice Joan Sawyer, as she was then known, on the 4th of February, in the Consolidated Supreme Court Action number 9 of 1981 and number 883 of 1993, adjudged that the Bahamian company Nassau Limited had been the beneficial owner of the Clifton heritage immediately prior to it being acquired in 1989. It is useful to note that Justice Sawyer allude to facts which support my doubt about the chain of title to the Clifton heritage. Her Ladyship is quoted at page 9 of her judgment as saying, and I quote, "There is one peripheral matter I should mention for the record. It is this. This court is not concerned with and has not been asked to deal with any matter concerning any proposed development on the land in question by any party. Indeed, it cannot be so asked since this court does not decide matters of policy. The question raised by the originating summons are purely matters of law to be decided against a factual background which is not in dispute. This judgment must be read and understood by everyone concerned. I now turn to the amended originating summons which was filed September 22nd, 1998. By that summons, the plaintiff seeks the determination of the court on the following questions. One was whether the plaintiff or any of the defendants was beneficially entitled to all or any of that piece of land or lot containing some 208 acres of land or thereabouts situate between Southwest Bay Street and Clifton Point in the constituency of Delaport in the island of New Providence immediately prior to the compulsory acquisition of the same under the Acquisition of Land Act. The second question which Her Ladyship had to answer was, to whom should the compensation be apportioned? And lastly, in what quantum or percentage should the compensation be distributed to those entitled to compensation? She went on to say that Mr. Adderley, on behalf of Nassau Limited, indicated in his opening address that at this stage, all the court was being asked to decide is whether the first defendant has proved its title to the subject land. And counsel, she goes on to say, for the plaintiff, second, third, and fourth defendants offered no evidence on behalf of their respective clients. And this is what is key to what she's saying is, I gather that that position was taken because of matters outside the purview of this court. And Mr. Speaker, I would note that there are a number of documents which I wish to table as we go along, but we will just simply deal with those at the end of the contribution. And I will table Her Ladyship's judgment. Nassau Limited, Mr. Speaker, is a company that was formed by the late Sir Stafford Sands in the early 1930s for and on behalf of Harry Oakes. And this company appeared as an adverse claimant in this quieting action, which had been started by O'Brien's Loans Limited, who claimed to be the owner of the Clifton heritage. Now, although that court action was abated by virtue of the 1989 compulsory acquisition, which was effected by Sir Lyndon Oscar Pinley as Minister responsible for acquisition of land, I find it very hard, Mr. Speaker, and in fact quite interesting, that a company such as Nassau Limited, owned by the person that it was owned by, could not convince the court that it was the owner of the land immediately prior to the 1989 acquisition. Now, when I add things up, Mr. Speaker, it appears that this company that started the action and the other adverse claimants, they must have made a deal in the year 2000 whereby they would be compensated if they dropped out of the action. You see, Mr. Speaker, it is not curious, or it is curious, that the descendants of Sir Harry Oakes, the man lauded as one of the largest landholders in the island of New Providence, could not over these many, many years get a certificate of title assuring ownership to the Clifton heritage. It strikes me as very odd. In fact, archaeologists confirm, Mr. Speaker, that the Clifton heritage had been continually occupied by people from the early 1700s straight on through to the late 1950s. Tucked away somewhere in the Department of Lands and Survey, Mr. Speaker, is an aerial photograph which evidences this fact, that the land was in fact occupied. Now, before I go much further, Mr. Speaker, I must declare under the rules of this House that I have an interest in this matter and this bill. Although I will show how each and everyone else in this place have similar or same interests. I am the named plaintiff in an action against the Treasurer of the Bahamas, whereby originating summons, Mr. Speaker, I sought a number of declarations from the court to clarify that by the 1989 acquisition, the Clifton heritage was being held on a statutory trust by the Treasurer of the Bahamas as trustee for the benefit of the Bahamian people. Mr. Speaker, as one of the beneficiaries of that trust, I was asking the court, among other things, to declare that the Treasurer could not, and I repeat, that the Treasurer could not transfer title to the Clifton heritage to a private entity or other party unless she received the unanimous, underscore unanimous, Mr. Speaker, approval of both houses of Parliament. Now, as such unanimous approval had not been granted, I sought a court declaration that a conveyance done by the F&M administration at the time of the Clifton heritage, as it was proposed in a resolution passed on the 22nd of May 2000 in this place, that such resolution or such transfer would be null and void if they attempted to do that. And I would have an affidavit, Mr. Speaker, that I would also table in this House to put all of the evidence that would have been made before the court at that time. Now, that resolution was passed by simple majority, Mr. Speaker, simple majority, giving the Treasurer authority to convey the land back to Nassau Limited. 19 of the 40 members of Parliament either opposed the resolution or were absent from the House of Assembly at the time of voting on that resolution. What is odd about that resolution is that it did not specify the purpose for which the land could be conveyed, although the F&M administration was quite aware that Nassau Limited intended to sell the land for the construction of a housing development. They also knew, Mr. Speaker, that such purpose was for a private purpose rather than a public one, and the intended use was inconsistent with environmental and cultural heritage preservation. But they didn't care. They did not care, Mr. Speaker, with the exception of the honourable member at the time for Shirley, Pierre Depuch, who voted no to the resolution, although he was a part of that administration. He's a real man. And it was reported that he would be punished for that, and he was. But he is still a real man in my eyes and in the eyes of the thousands of Bahamians that stood in support of saving Clifton. In this House today, Mr. Speaker, a number of the persons who sit on the opposition side now, they ducked out. They didn't even show up to Parliament. They're not real men. Only two who sit in the opposition that voted yes, are in here today. The rest of them are out.
Speak on a point of order.
Yes.
I think it's really amusing that the member for Mount Moriah would accuse the F&M of the members of the F&M for sitting out. And I look around this chamber today and see the few members who have such a so few members of the governing party here that have such a passion for this, and certainly the two of the three members from Grand Bahama had to fly out for another function. They were here yesterday and today. So for the member for Mount Moriah to say we are boycotting this session is totally untrue, and to also say that the member for the former cabinet minister in the F&M government was punished for voting no on a previous bill without some proof of that, should withdraw that remark. Thank you very much.
Just want to explain that there are a number of events that involve government ministers and members on our side. Normally we don't meet on Thursdays. There are, for example, at least 3 international conferences that are being held on this island at this time. And so I think that you will find that this chamber will be eventually filled from our side, but some of those persons are now doing other things. So, and they will be coming. Most of them have already spoken also.
Just said, and I said that two of our members are also at one of those conferences, so I said for the member to say, and at the time he made that remark, neither of the independent members were here, so to say we were boycotting, the other members are boycotting, this is really very unfair.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate what...
The records of the House should reflect the truth. I believe this matter was dealt with in 2000. At that stage, the member for Shirley, he did vote against it. And yes, but he was not a member of the government at the time. And he was dismissed from the cabinet prior to that being brought here. And I was not a member of the government at the time. I had resigned from the cabinet some months before that was brought here, just to make sure that the records of the House are accurate. Mr. Speaker, I don't want the member from Mount Moriah. He's doing well. The statements, but we don't want to leave him there with inaccuracies on the record. He should withdraw those remarks in the interest of accuracy.
Mr. Speaker, I believe, unfortunately, that the honourable members all missed what I said. I was not commenting at all about who's in here now and whether they're here to listen to me. I was talking about what happened back in 2000. I am extremely thorough. I have a certified copy of the members who were present during that voting session from this House. No, you were not present. You were absent. You were absent. What I said is that from those who sit in the opposition, now I don't know if you consider yourself in the opposition, Honourable Member for Bamboo, but for those who sit in the opposition, this record, certified by the Honourable House of Assembly, says that the Honourable Member for North Abaco and the Honourable Member for North Eleuthera are the only two, as well as the Honourable Member for South Abaco, were the three who voted yes for the development that are still here today. All of the others who sit in the opposition side were not here. They were not here to vote. This record does not show they were here to vote. We're talking about who voted. They ducked. They were scared. They were scared because they knew that their constituents did not want them to support that bill. It is here, in affidavit form.
What I'm saying is that the member for Shirley and the member for Bamboo Town was not members in the government at that time. We were not cabinet members. We had already resigned.
I concede that. I concede that.
All right. That's so. All I ask you to do is withdraw that remark.
I concede that. That would have been inaccurate. I would not have known that for certain. But as members of this honourable House, certainly. As we look, Mr. Speaker, as we look at this affidavit, Mr. Speaker, I put my whole life on the line, and I'm not going to kid. And I've sworn a testimony to the facts that I'm stating in here today, and I'm prepared to put it as I do in the records of this House for any and all to see, to comment on, one way or the other. I'm only here to talk about truth and what I truly believe. Mr. Speaker, this affidavit and all that I have to say would be able to show and support my contention, Mr. Speaker, that there was a conspiracy by high-ranking government officials at the time and other persons in this country to swindle the land at Clfton from the Bahamian people and to willfully, Mr. Speaker, hide their hands in the sand so as to pretend that there was no problem. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member for North Abaco, who is not here at the moment, who was then the Prime Minister, he simply said on a radio program that he was going to wash his hands of the matter, because that would have been his way, Mr. Speaker, of achieving the goal of getting that development off the ground. The people of this country, Mr. Speaker, through their representatives in Parliament, not the Prime Minister by himself, had to agree at that time to sell or convey the Clfton heritage or to use it for some other purpose than what it was acquired for, which was the port terminal. In my view, Mr. Speaker, there is a distinct difference between acquired land under the Acquisition of Land Act and Crown land. With Crown land, Mr. Speaker, it is my view that the ministers responsible for disposing of or giving it away can do that in accordance with the law. But, Mr. Speaker, when you have land that is acquired under the Act, it's different, because such land is acquired on a statutory trust for the benefit of the Bahamian people. It is strike law, Mr. Speaker, and all of the lawyers in here, I think, will agree with me, that once you settle a trust and you have your terms of the trust, you are not permitted to change the terms of the trust until and unless, Mr. Speaker, you have concurrence of all of the beneficiaries. Now, we know, of course, that there is some level of problem when you talk about a country with hundreds of thousands of people, and how do you get to canvass them to see if they agree with you? Well, I believe that the F&M did follow, in part, a part of the procedure. They came to this Honourable House. But in order for them to conjecture or to suggest or to say that all of the Bahamian people agreed with them, they needed to have unanimous approval in here.
I listened to him. I heard a portion of what he said when I was outside on the other side of the bar there. But I think he should be accurate. He is a lawyer, and he should be accurate in the law as well. I don't know, maybe I am wrong, but I don't know what is his basis in law for saying that you need the unanimous consent of all the members of Parliament to deal with land that the government have acquired. I don't know what is the basis of that. I have never seen that happen before. Otherwise, the government hands would be tied. Most housing developments in this country, all the housing developments in this country, titles will be defective if that is so. Or most of them anyway, or some of them would be defective. So I think the member should be careful. The member should be careful on how he, or the statements of law that he is putting forward on the floor of the House. I think as a lawyer you should be careful, and I would suggest that you check that to see whether it is accurate or not. I have my doubts that that statement is accurate.
Mr. Speaker, I am much obliged to the Honourable Member for Bamboo Town, who is an Honourable Member at the bar. Well, Mr. Speaker, I did say in my view, and my view is based on Section 2 of the Acquisition of Land Act, which stipulates the purposes for which land could be acquired, and if you change the purpose, what things you can change it for. And there is nowhere in here which suggests that it could be given to a private company for a private profitable purpose. It doesn't suggest that. Now, when I marry that, Mr. Speaker, with my knowledge of the common law, a case, Mr. Speaker, which is named Sanders and Vautier, which sets out the established principle that you have to have the concurrence of every beneficiary before you change the corpus of the trust. That, Mr. Speaker, is what I know. And if I am wrong, obviously this would not be the place to argue that. It would be somewhere else. But that is my view, Mr. Speaker. That is my view, and I contend that as forcefully as I possibly can at this moment. And so I do feel, to answer the member's comment, that I am accurate in my assessment. But you know, Mr. Speaker, like many others, and it was very difficult to make a determination to jump into this fight in the way to essentially throw myself, if you would, in the possible public odium to deal with this matter in this way, because to me it was like a last-ditch effort. The leaders of this country had assembled here with the intention to give away this land for a purpose which was certainly sacrilege, to say the least. But at that time, Mr. Speaker, at that time, I remember the words of the Honorable Marcus Garvey as he challenged Africans in the diaspora way back in his day. He is quoted, Mr. Speaker, and I will quote, as saying, when a man fails to grasp his authority, he sinks to the level of the lower animals. And whatsoever the real man bids him do, even as if it were a lower animal, that much shall he do. For the last 400 years, the Negro has been in the position of being condemned and commanded, even as the lower animals are controlled. Our race has been without a will, without a purpose of its own, for all this length of time. Because of that, we have developed few men who are able to understand the strenuousness of the age in which we live. Where can we find in this race our real men? Men of character, men of purpose, men of confidence, men of faith, men who really know themselves. I have come across so many weaklings who profess to be leaders, and in the test, I have found them to be but the slaves of a nobler class. They perform the will of their masters without question. To me, a man has no master but God. Man in his authority is a sovereign Lord. As for the individual man, so of the individual race. This feeling makes man so courageous, so bold, as to make it impossible for his brother to intrude upon his rights. So few of us can understand what it takes to make a man the man who will never say die, the man who will never give up, the man who will never depend on others to do for him what he can do for himself, the man who will not blame God, the man who will not blame nature, the man who will not blame fate for his condition, but the man who will go out and make conditions to suit himself. If 400 million Negroes can get to know themselves, to know that in them is a sovereign power, is an authority that is absolute, then in the next 24 hours we would have a new race, we would have a new nation, an empire resurrected not from the will of others to see us rise, but from our own determination to rise irrespective of what the world thinks. End quote. The fight to save Clifton, Mr. Speaker, saw the rise of such men and women that Marcus Garvey hoped for. I wish to mention by name 4 of them. Miss Sam Duncombe, Senator Reverend Dr. C.B. Moore, Mr. Vivian Wiley, and if I might, yours truly. And Mr. Speaker, the loose arrangement that happened with these 4 people who are different backgrounds, just sort of happened naturally, which gives me a feeling of awe that these 4 people could find themselves coming together. Sam Duncombe is a known environmentalist, and so she paid attention to the environmental issues. Reverend C.B. Moore, as you know, is a social activist, and so he took part in the social troubles that happened or that would happen if the Clfton development happened. Vivian Wiley, around whom all of us centered ourselves, can trace his ancestry back to the plantation. And so he had a feeling, Mr. Speaker, that was different from all of us because this was his heritage. And so then, Mr. Speaker, my job was simply to do the coordination and to bring whatever level of expertise that I had from the law and otherwise. This effective division of specialty, Mr. Speaker, came together naturally at the town meeting that was held on the evening of the 4th of February in 1999 at St. Paul's Catholic Church, just outside of Leicester. That meeting, Mr. Speaker, that meeting was chaired by the Honorable Tommy Tunquist, who just so happened, Mr. Speaker, to be the person who ended up being the person I unseated in the last general election. At that meeting, Mr. Speaker, if you were not there, bear with me as I try to relay the feeling that existed. Mr. Speaker, this room perhaps can comfortably seat 300 people. There were overflows. Every chair was occupied. Every inch of the floor space around the rooms were filled. and every inch of the porch outside of this church was filled. There must have been comfortably about 800 people at this town meeting. And Mr. Speaker, there was a sense of anger, there was a sense of concern, there was a sense of feeling where so many people from so many countries, so many backgrounds, came together for one purpose: to share the enthusiasm to stop that development, albeit for many different reasons, but at the same time, Mr. Speaker, finding their way together, meshed, as if it was destined to be so. That was a powerful feeling, Mr. Speaker. I left from that meeting after we were all charged by the Honorable Mr. Turnquest that we should go away and come back with our concerns before the 28th of February of that month, which would have been about 3 weeks later. And if we did not meet that deadline, that naturally that they would then be encouraged to proceed and disregard our interests. I went away, Mr. Speaker, and determined that I have to do something to help facilitate this so that the games, Mr. Speaker, that could be played was not played. On the 26th of February, sorry, not the 26th, on the 18th of February of that year, Mr. Speaker, we did have a town meeting at the BCPOU Hall on Farrington Road. That was attended by at least 500 or 600 people. And we had a panelist of essentially 3 people. Mr. Wayne Monroe, who is a known attorney and I think currently serves as president of the Bar Association, Mr. Ann Duncan, Mr. Vivian Wiley, and myself. And we had reporters for the meeting, Rappaport, who, Mr. Speaker, took notes, took minutes, and we compiled, Mr. Speaker, the report which I have here to be tabled before you. And we compiled that report and submitted it to Mr. Turnquest, who was then serving as the Minister of State, I believe, for the Ministry of Work and Utilities. And we did receive, Mr. Speaker, an acknowledgement of that meeting, an acknowledgement of that letter and report that was sent. Mr. Speaker, this town meeting, which was held and which was sponsored by the Bahamas Altruistic Coalition for Unity and Success, known as Bahacus, an organization that I had formed some time before, was able to catalog the major concerns and issues that became a part of the foundation upon which the fight continued for many, many years thereafter. Mr. Speaker, when we look at the fact that the judgment of her ladyship essentially says and suggests that the title in Clfton had gone, that it was no longer that of Nassau Limited. And when we know that the F&M administration at the time knew about the environmental dangers, they knew of the imminent destruction and or the scientific tampering of delicate African slave ruins and other archaeological and anthropological heritage, if that proposed project had happened, it was at best, Mr. Speaker, reckless for that administration to attempt to achieve through the back door that which they were not allowed, Mr. Speaker, to get through the front door of the law. To make matters worse, the posture which was being taken flew in the face of any concept of good governance using cost-benefit analysis to determine whether a public project should be had. To not do this kind of a procedure and process and proceed in any event, Mr. Speaker, on the basis of hiding his head in the sand and not observing the numerous warnings being given would have amounted, Mr. Speaker, and in my view constitute a dismantling of democracy and morality, if not various crimes under the provisions of the Penal Code. What is interesting also, Mr. Speaker, is that all of the information they needed they had on or about the 23rd of September of 1998, The then government of the Bahamas had contracted scientists named Law, Engineering and Environmental Services Incorporated out of Miami, Florida. And in their report entitled An Evaluation of the Environmental Impact Assessment for the Proposed Clifton Key Development that was presented to the office of the Prime Minister, they quoted and were very exact in saying, Mr. Speaker, that they did not feel that this project should be allowed to be had, as they were looking at the environmental impact assessment which was conducted by the proposed developers. And it says, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, they said, the EIA does not adequately address the potential impact the development would have on known cultural resources. The EIA recognizes the presence of historic architecture, but makes no mention of archaeological content associated with the structures of the Lucayan site. The EIA makes no mention of what alternatives were explored to preserve the site, other than to say that the structures would be restored. It also makes no mention of what studies will be performed to ensure proper preservation and conservation measures. It is important to note that restoration implies returning the structure to their state at a particular point in time. They go on to say that according to the Venice Charter, restoration should only be undertaken when adequate documentary or other empirical evidence is available. The Clifton structures are probably better candidates for preservation and conservation alternatives. Mr. Speaker, with remarks such as this, and as powerful as it is, the F&M administration still decided that they would proceed to have this project put in the hands of profiteering people who had no interest other than to get what they could get and leave this country. Then, Mr. Speaker, along came the archaeological report which was delivered to the Prime Minister's office in October of 1999. But this report, Mr. Speaker, was only made available to the Bahamian public after a very strong letter was written to the Prime Minister, which I wish to quote in part. It is addressed to the Honourable Hubert Ingram. And all of these documents, again, Mr. Speaker, I have to table before you. I write to you concerning the preservation and ultimate restoration of African slave ruins on the land area of the proposed Clifton gated community development, known as the Clifton Estate and Clifton Bay, situated at the southwestern end of the island of your province. I understand that responding to an invitation by your government, Dr. Laurie Wilkie of the University of California at Berkeley and Dr. Powell Farnsworth of the University of Louisiana made a proposal to conduct archaeological reconnaissance and test excavation within the boundaries of the proposed Clifton gated community development. The ultimate purpose was to collect data and thereafter make a report to government on the slave ruins and other historical and archaeological remains in the area, which comprises 208.41 acres of land acquired by our government in 1989 and vested in the Treasury of the Bahamas in accordance with our law. The proposal, which was accepted by your government in December of 1998, is believed to have been reduced to write a written contract and executed in April of 1999 by Senator Lynn Holoesco, then Ambassador for the Bahamas Environment, Science and Technology Commission, for and on behalf of your office. The contract required payment of over $100,000 by government, presumably from the public treasury. Payment was made. The letter goes on, Mr. Speaker. Having regard to their findings, Drs. Wilkie and Farnsworth were to, inter alia, opine as to whether the proposed Clifton gated community development should be completed on the Clifton estate as proposed by the developer Chaffin Light Associates, which is being financed by the Bechtel Family Trust, both of the United States of America. Sometime in May or June of 1999, Drs. Wilkie and Farnsworth completed their excavation and gave a presentation on the 17th of June 1999 at the Bahamas Hotel Training College to the public at large. On the basis of that presentation, I adopted the belief that their report to you and your colleagues in government, believed to have been completed in mid-October 1999, was not going to be favorable to the Clifton gated community development. While the report has not yet found its way to the public, so that worthwhile debate and determination could be made by the Bahamian people as to whether the Clifton gated community development should be had, I strongly assert that you and perhaps certain members of the cabinet have already seen the document. Not having found any member of parliament who has seen the report as yet makes me believe that only one original copy of the report was provided to your office for your eyes only. However, given the apparent power already being wielded by Mr. James Chaffin, President of Chaffin Life Associates, to have secured a speaking spot at the recent Bahamas Business Outlook 2000, I am left to conclude that he may have also had sight of the report. His presumably self-chosen topic was smart growth, by which he was essentially asserting that his proposed Clifton gated community development subscribed to the principles of smart growth. This is too incidental. For Mr. Chaffin's purposes, smart growth refers to development which enhances community livability for all Bahamians, accounts and adheres to environmental concerns, and assures overall economic viability. The Bahamian public has resounded very loudly that it sees the proposed Clifton gated community development failing on the enhancement of community livability and environmental facets of Mr. Chaffin's smart growth principles. How is it that out of all of your qualified Bahamians and other great persons around the world, Mr. Chaffin was chosen to speak in such an important Bahamian forum, such as the Bahamas Business Outlook, at which you were keynote speaker? It is certainly odd, if not conspiratorial, that the Councillors Bahamas Limited, as promoters of the Bahamas Business Outlook 2000, booked a speaker whose main, if not only connection with the Bahamas, is his current application before your office for acceptance of a proposal which is rife with controversy and problems. Could it be that this was an attempt by the promoters to give Chaffin Light Associates the upper hand in addressing the concerns set out in the archaeological report? After all, I understand that the Councillors Bahamas Limited also represents Chaffin Light Associates in its efforts to have its application accepted by your office. Maybe it was you who determined, at least approved, the promoter's decision to have Mr. Chaffin speak on the same platform as you. Whichever it is, it smells fishy. My letter goes on, Mr. Speaker, to the Honourable Hubert Ingram, to say since 1982, you have been claiming that you and your colleagues in government exercise full transparency in your practice and operation of the people's government. If what I have learnt is true, coupled with the fact that a report from the government-contracted U.S.-based Law, Engineering and Environmental Sciences, Inc., dated the 23rd of September 1998, recommends that the project, as proposed, not be done, I am left to conclude that you and perhaps your cabinet are in the process of conspiring to defraud as well as fabricating information with the intention of misleading and deceiving our people. And Mr. Speaker, that assertion, I believe, went to the core of what was going on at the time, and whether it was actually because of this letter, or whether, Mr. Speaker, it was coincidental. The fact is that the report was in fact made shortly after that letter was delivered to the Honourable Prime Minister. But you know what is interesting about the report, Mr. Speaker, is that there were two reports, Mr. Speaker, that were issued. One, Mr. Speaker, which was actually made available to the public, is this very big archaeological reconnaissance report that has very detailed information about what exists at Clifton. These are things, Mr. Speaker, that this authority that we are starting to set up by this legislation must have in its records. And so it is important that this be tabled. But what is interesting about this document, Mr. Speaker, is that it is dated January 2000. But, Mr. Speaker, similar to the Honourable Member for Baines and Grand Town. I had this ability in those days, Mr. Speaker, to fortunately find documents in my garbage bin. And I have one, Mr. Speaker, where the conclusion is different from that other big document, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, as you will note when you have a chance to look at it closely, that the big one is dated January 2000. The smaller one, which is only the conclusion part, are dated October 1999. Now what is the significance of this? The significance, Mr. Speaker, is that the big one essentially says that, there are some difficulties that need to be had, etc., and we need to pay attention to. But the small one makes it very clear, in no uncertain terms, that the archaeologists preferred and stated that they wish for there not to be any development of any part of Clfton because, Mr. Speaker, because there were too many treasures which we have at the Clfton site and the Clfton heritage. That is the one. See, I think we share the same garbage bin. And you see, Mr. Speaker, it is so important that we note this fact because shortly after this was disclosed by those very honorable professors, they found that they no longer had a permit to function and to continue on with their excavation and studies at Clfton. Mr. Speaker, the F&M administration vilified and victimized those two honorable professors. So much so that Dr. Wilkie, I believe, suffered some delay in being given her tenure as a professor at her university because of a report which suggested that she was doing something untoward by speaking as an academician at our college of the Bahamas about what she found at Clfton. That was done by the F&M administration. And I wish, Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure the executive of the Progressive Liberal Party administration will in fact invite her to come back, I wish, as I stand on my feet, to say, on behalf, if I can, Mr. Speaker, of every person who supported the fight to save Clifton, to say across the waves to Dr. Wilkie that she's welcome to come back.
Point of order. I just wish to advise the honourable member that his wish has in fact become a reality because on instruction of the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, an official invitation has been extended to both Dr. Wilkie and Dr. Farnsworth to return to the Bahamas as a matter of urgency to complete the work that they have been doing, and details are now being worked out for both Dr. Wilkie and Dr. Farnsworth to return as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, that is what the Progressive Liberal Party is all about. Great organization. And I want to just resound that they are welcome to come back. They have done a great job thus far, and I look forward to seeing them here as they dig in the dirt to find more and more of the artifacts which we have that shows, and that is a testament, Mr. Speaker, to the heritage which we have on this island. After seeing those kind of reports, Mr. Speaker, and in knowing now what this Progressive Liberal Party government has determined to do, it is no surprise, Mr. Speaker, that the late, great, most honorable, distinguished Sir Lyndon Oscar Pinling, back in 1989, Mr. Speaker, determined not to proceed with building that port terminal at Clfton because he was told by environmental scientists that it would not be in the best interest of the environment if that port terminal was built out there. And it stopped. That is the reason why, Mr. Speaker, there is no port terminal at Clfton now. It was acquired for that purpose. But there's a report produced by Rendell and Triton Engineering, who told the then Progressive Liberal Party administration, you can't proceed. You're going to mess up the reefs. You're going to mess up all of the things that you try to do, any of that stuff over there. Don't do it. They did not do it. Mr. Speaker, that is why today I stand on this side of the aisle, saying that I am proud to be a part of the PLP. I'm proud to be a part of a party which, by virtue of what it is and what it has in it, it inculcates a level of humanity in all those who enter and who remain when they come in. Mr. Speaker, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that this same feeling which you get from being in and around the Progressive Liberal Party and looking at the historical factors about what took place in times gone by, it is no doubt that that is one of the pivotal things and platform points which this current PLP administration relates to when it talks about the environment. And we know, we've seen our plan, and I believe our plan has been tabled before this House. And at page 36, Mr. Speaker, where it talks about preservation and enhancement of the environment, I wish to quote what it is that the Progressive Liberal Party believes in. It says that every person in the Bahamas should be guaranteed the right to enjoy a healthy and productive environment free from the threat of environmental abuse and degradation or degradation of our ecological, cultural, and historical heritage. From the numerous things that our plan highlighted as its campaign pledges, Mr. Speaker, 3 of them relating to Clifton. These 3 things are that they wanted to preserve, the party seeks to preserve and protect the natural environment of the Bahamas in trust for future generations. It seeks to safeguard for all time the Exuma Land and Sea Park, the Inagua National Park, all other national parks, our reefs, our public beaches, and our wetlands. And lastly, it wanted to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that Clifton Keod becomes and remains state-owned and is developed as an international cultural center with protection and preservation of its historic, cultural, and environmental integrity. This set, Mr. Speaker, the foundation upon which I assert now that amounts to the real and the full intention of this bill. It is against this background, Mr. Speaker, that I honestly believe that our current Prime Minister, the Honourable Perry Gladstone Christie, who was then the opposition leader, delivered from the shores of Clifton itself, on behalf of the PLP, a statement which I continue to be convinced played a very pivotal role in halting the development of Clifton. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that it is necessary for this speech to actually be tabled in this House. It's a powerful speech, Mr. Speaker. And if I may say, it may be one of the greatest speeches that the Honourable Prime Minister may have made, and certainly that is documented. I read, Mr. Speaker, today, and it's important, Mr. Speaker, to read this into the record because this, I believe, speaks to why this Prime Minister and this organization that leads the government believes that Clifton should be saved. Today, I am announcing the official position of the Progressive Liberal Party on a matter of great public interest. It is a position which foreshadows extreme measures such as I have never before articulated on any issue. I expect never to have to do so again, but frankly, the arrogant bullheadedness of the present government, and more recently, the complete abdication of their responsibility with respect to the proposed Clifton Keod development have left me with no alternative in this particular case. I have given this matter a great deal of thought and prayerful consideration, and I have consulted my colleagues closely. We are all satisfied of the moral correctness of the position I am unveiling today. More than a year ago, on February 7th, 1999, to be precise, I issued a press statement calling upon the government to desist from approving the proposed development of some 600 acres of Clifton Key as a gated community for 600 foreign families. I summarize the social, cultural, historical, and environmental objections to the project and offered an alternative vision for the preservation of Clifton Key and its environs as a national park, unspoiled by the grimy hands of commercial desecration. More particularly, I invited the government on that occasion to dedicate the Clifton Key property as a national park, emphasizing the preservation of the Wiley Plantation ruins, the cliffs, the wetlands, forests, and beaches for present and future generations. I also invited the government to guarantee to the Bahamian people the same unimpeded access to the same beaches, picnic areas, and boat launching sites that have always enjoyed. I concluded my statement by saying that it is not too late for the government to realize the folly of its present course. That cry, like the cries of so many other Bahamians and residents of goodwill, fell on deaf ears. The government, irritated by the onslaught of public protests, seemed only more determined than ever to shove the proposed project down the throats of the Bahamian people. Before I tell you what I intend to do about it, let me first tell you why we of the Progressive Liberal Party are so passionately and irrevocably opposed to the Clifton Key development, and why it is an issue which arouses such deep emotions in the Bahamian people. The Honorable Perry Christie went on to say that the ancestors of 85 out of every 100 Bahamians came from Africa, mostly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, some directly on slave ships from the African continent, others by way of the American colonies. The ancestors of the other 15% of our population came from Europe, mostly by way of America, after the War of Independence, near the end of the 18th century. What brought these two races together was the institution of slavery, and from that common nexus, our society has evolved ever since, each race being bound to the other in a common destiny and a shared heritage. Few physical traces of Bahamian slave culture have survived. Rather, more, but still relatively few, physical traces of white loyalist plantation society have endured. Physical reminders of both, however, are found in abundance and in coherent pattern at Clifton Key in the form of slave cabins and kitchens, plantation walls, the ruins of William Wiley's great house, and numerous other structures and artifacts from that period. In their totality, they represent one of the most complete, tangible, and enduring links to our ancestors and their way of life. But there is more. Clifton was also the site of Lucayan villages, dating back as far as the first millennium and continuing up to the time of the Spanish occupation under Christopher Columbus. These Lucayan villages, the remains of which are mostly beneath the surface at Clifton, have only recently been discovered by the government's own archaeological consultants, Professors Farnsworth and Wilkie. In their January 2000 report to the government, they state that these Lucayan villages are among the oldest, if not, in fact, the oldest, to be found anywhere in the Bahamas, and the only site still extant and available for further study. In other words, the archaeological consultants, the government's own archaeological consultants, stated that the sites still preserved at Clifton may represent the last opportunity to learn about the daily lives of the people who first made the island their home. Thus, all three ethnic azaries of our heritage, Lucayan Indian, European, and African, are to be found at Clifton. Indeed, as Professors Farnsworth and Wilkie concluded in their report to the government, it is our professional opinion that no single property in the Bahamas should contain as many equally significant prehistoric and historic cultural resources as are located at the Clifton plantation property. Indeed, the property at Clifton is so immensely important to the historical context that it is virtually certain to qualify as a World Heritage Site. As such, it would qualify for substantial international funding aimed at promoting its conservation as a national park. This would generate worldwide appeal. In the process, Clifton could become a vital component of the tourism product of the Bahamas, attracting untold thousands of visitors while bringing present and future generations of the Bahamians into direct contact with our heritage in a way which could only deepen our Bahamian identity and knowledge of our history. One other byproduct of this, of course, would be the creation of hundreds of new permanent jobs for the Bahamians. None of this will be possible, however, if the Clifton Key development is brought to fruition. The then leader of the opposition went on to say, a tour of Clifton is an emotional experience for any Bahamian, but especially so for Bahamians of African descent. Amidst the jagged rocks near the ocean's edge is a narrow bathing basin. It was into this bathing area that disembarking slaves, our own forefathers and mothers, were led while fresh water was dumped on them from the rocks above to wash away the filth from their bodies that their bodies had accumulated in a long voyage across the Atlantic from the African homeland into slavery. This was their first encounter with the Bahamas and the New World. Thus, when we touch those rocks, when we stand upon those rocks and peer down into this ancient bathing basin, we are, in the only way left to us now, making contact with our ancestors and paying homage to them and their struggles. It is a sacred shrine. The ancient bathing basin cut into the rocks is still there, but as Clifton development proceeds, it will be blown to bits so that the canal of luxury yachts can pass through. That is not progress. It is sacrilege. But there is a great deal more to Clifton than that, for the precious ruins of slave houses and associated structures are to be found over a much wider area. In all, 15 structures have been discovered to date, but the government's own archaeological consultants have reported that there are probably more structures which lay beneath the surface. Only subsurface testing and extensive archaeological excavation at Clifton will unearth these hidden links to our past. That is what the government's our own archaeological consultants have advised them. In their own words, they say, the testing at the Alexandria site revealed two previously unknown buried historic structures to the south of the standing structures. The wattle and mortar, mid-late 18th century, discovered near the beach suggests that other earlier historical resources may still also be preserved beneath the surface, both in this area and elsewhere on the plantation. Only large excavations in this area will reveal more evidence about this structure and the possibility of similar structures nearby. Further excavations will also be required to determine if this structure was occupied by some of the oldest African people in the Bahamas. Mr. Christie went on to say, it will be readily appreciated, therefore, that the idea that the developers can somehow make amends by throwing up arbitrary 30-foot open space around known structures is both ludicrous and hopelessly inadequate. But it is not the historical importance of Clifton which alone compels us to stand foursquare against the proposed development. There are powerful ecological and social reasons as well. Clifton is home to some of the most ecologically important wetlands in the whole of New Providence, the source of life and sustenance for many hundreds of species of birds and other forms of plant and animal life. The sensitive ecological balance of these wetlands and surrounding forests would be irreparably compromised by the mammoth-scale construction that would ensue from the approval of the Clifton Key development. We cannot permit that to happen. In the social context, the case against Clifton Key development is even more unanswerable. New Providence is an island. An island is, of course, a body of land surrounded by water. And yet, nearly all of that water is inaccessible to all but few Bahamians. In particular, nearly all of our public beaches and traditional picnic areas are being systematically lost to private developers. The Clifton Key development will only add to this national tragedy, and egregiously so. Bahamians will be left with a straggly bit of beach, while the prime beach areas with their wonderful surroundings will become the private preserve for 600 mostly foreign families who will make up the new gated community. How much more of this can the Bahamian people expect to take? Indeed, has the government for one moment stopped to think that perhaps one of the reasons why we are beset by so much frustration, anger, interpersonal dysfunction, and criminal violence in our over-the-hill communities is because we are becoming more and more caged, more and more cooped up, without ready access to beaches and coastal areas and vistas of the sea and sunset, which are so central to our identity as an island people and so vital to our need for recreation, relaxation, tranquility, and a sense of well-being. Further, on all of our islands, as small as ours, with an ever-burgeoning population, which is already more than 200,000, we can ill afford the prospect of yet another huge swath of our coastal line being tied up as yet another large-scale gated community for the few. A gated community far bigger than any before. This is exceptionally short-sighted social planning. We must stop looking only at short-term positions, but instead focus on how these construction booms the government is forever bragging about will impact the long-term development of New Providence as a habitat for the vast majority of our people. A short-term job fix must not be the only thing we look at as a quid pro for approving large-scale resort and residential enclaves, which will, in the long run, cause incalculable harm to our social planning and diminish the overall quality of life in our nation's capital. In summary, Mr. Christie then went on to say, therefore, we are firmly of the view that the Clfton Key property is too sacred a component of the history and cultural heritage of the Bahamas, too valuable a part of the natural environment, and too central the future social planning needs of Bahamians to be sacrificed on the altar of real estate profiteering for the benefit of the foreign few at the expense of the many. The government has behaved shamelessly in this matter. It has now moved from intransigence and defiance to a complete abdication of its responsibility. I refer, of course, to the recent announcement of the Prime Minister on Love 97 radio, he's talking about Prime Minister Ingram, that he was washing his hands of the Clfton Key matter. That the present owners can sell to whomever they like, and they can do what they will. That is nonsense, exclaimed Mr. Christie. Worse still, it is madness. The government cannot play Pontius Pilate. It cannot duck its duty to govern. More particularly, the government has no lawful choice but to decide whether it will approve the acquisition of Clfton land by Chaffin and Associates and issue the necessary permits under the International Landholdings Act, whether it will give investment board's approval to the proposed use of the land as gated community for 600 families, with all attendant destruction of precious historical and cultural resources, whether it will grant the required building permits of the construction which is proposed for the development, and whether it will and is obliged under the Antiquities, Monuments and Museum Act to preserve the Clfton property as a historic site rather than allow the historic resources on that property to be destroyed or irrevocably compromised. Mr. Christie went on to say that it is disgraceful that the government has given notice that it intends to shirk those responsibilities and to duck its duty to exercise the discretion and judgment required of the government as a matter of law, constitutional principle, and political morality. Since the government has now decided to abdicate its responsibilities, we, the official opposition, Progressive Liberal Party, are left with no choice but to show the way forward. In this regard, we have come to certain resolutions, and I now declare them, says Mr. Christie. We hereby put Chaffin and Associates, the Bechtel Corporation, and all other partners or financiers of the proposed Clfton Key development project on public notice that when the Progressive Liberal Party, and this is this is prophetic, Mr. Speaker, that when the Progressive Liberal Party regains power following the next general election, we shall forthwith rescind all building approvals and permits which may have been issued by the F&M government for that project. Any construction then in progress will be terminated immediately, and no new construction will be permitted. Further, we will simultaneously take the necessary steps under the Acquisition of Land Act to compulsorily acquire in the public interest all of the land that would have been sold to the developers. So doing, we will of course pay compensation to the landowners in accordance with the provision of the Act and the Constitution of the Bahamas. If Mr. Chaffin and Bechtel want to roll the dice and gamble that the PLP will not win the next election, general election, or that the PLP, which won more than 40% of the popular vote in the last general election, will change its mind, they are, of course, free to take that gamble. Let me assure them, however, that the position I have announced is irrevocable, exclaimed Mr. Christie. The Clifton Key development may start under the F&M, but under the PLP, it will be brought to a screeching halt. He concludes saying that let all parties concerned, therefore, be forewarned and deport themselves accordingly. Let no one be heard to say later that we did not put them on notice of our position before they took the plunge. Accordingly, before anyone commits his money to this project, before anyone puts pen to any purchase of the property, and before the government and Chaffin and Mr. Chaffin sign any heads of agreement, let them all know in no uncertain terms that the position of the Progressive Liberal Party, the position of Perry Gladstone Christie, and the position of his parliamentary colleagues is in this most exceptional, unprecedented, and sorry affair. It should never have come to this. It should never have gotten this far. The property at Clifton is too precious, too priceless, too important a part of the national patrimony to be squandered on another gated community. The government, that is the F&M government, has abdicated its responsibility. We, the Progressive Liberal Party, will not abdicate ours. Mr. Speaker, I thank you for your tolerance in reading that very historic and profound statement into the record of this House. Because, Mr. Speaker, I believe that it conveys at the bottom of it all what the real intentions are behind this bill. And that is, in short, that Clifton is now acquired and will now be, through the Clifton Heritage Authority, protected for all Bahamians in perpetuity into the future without question at all. You know, Mr. Speaker, there are some people who would also say that perhaps this piece of land that we are talking about should really be contributed to the Bahamas National Trust, because the Bahamas National Trust is, of course, the statutory body into which property is supposed to be placed for the benefit of the Bahamian people. And a part of what the trust is responsible for is, of course, to preserve such land for the benefit of our people. And, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that all things are done to help us to understand the kinds of environmental importance and historical importance to these issues. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, as I've indicated on previous occasions before this House, the Bahamas National Trust, because at the time of its inept and questionable management, did not always reflect the wishes of the Bahamian people. In fact, under the leadership of the then Executive Director, Mr. Gary Lawson, and his deputy, his wife, Susan Lawson, the Council of the Bahamas National Trust, in my view, was misled on the issue of Clifton. As someone is quoted as having said, is that the executive team may have missed the importance of their role and seem to have been pursuing and maintaining affluence at the expense of the environment. I am now glad to know that Mr. Lawson has been asked to leave the executive management and leadership of the Bahamas National Trust. And as far as his activity, I will not miss those activities. While I believe he may have been asked as one of the sitting executives of the trust to serve on that committee by our current Prime Minister to review the issue on how we are to fund the compensation part of the Clfton community, I want to echo as strongly as I can that we cannot have any further involvement of people such as he in the affairs of saving and protecting Clfton. Because you see, Mr. Speaker, it was people such as him who overstepped their role and did everything in their power to mislead the government at the time and to mislead the council at the time. It's people like him, Mr. Speaker, who would be very happy to continue to get benefit from what it is that Clfton represents. No one, Mr. Speaker, who was in favor of that development as strenuously and as openly as these people were should be allowed, Mr. Speaker, to financially benefit at the back end. I believe you take a stand. You're either on one side or you're on the other side in this fight. There's no middle ground. There cannot be any middle ground. No fence riding, no wall jumping. You are on one side, one way or the other. You take your stand, you plant yourself. I did. Vivian Wiley did. C.V. Morse did. Sam Duncombe did. And I can go on with a list of so many other people, hundreds, who took the stand to say that they wanted to protect Clfton. It was interesting, Mr. Speaker, that not until the year 2000, April to be exact, under a new president, you see, the old president of the Bahamas National Trust at the time, who was supportive of the development, was Mrs. Sandy Buckner of the Sandy Port development operation. And we know that Sandy Port, Mr. Speaker, is being built and has been built for years on one of the most extensive wetlands that we have on this island. They got the permit, Mr. Speaker, a long time ago. They dredged, they covered up, they sunk, they did everything you can imagine to the wetlands. And at that time, she sat as the president of the trust. And during that time, Mr. Speaker, while she was president of the trust, she also gave the impression, Mr. Speaker, that the Clfton gated community development was okay to be had. Not until, Mr. Speaker, a very bold, brave Bahamian soul connected with Inagua, Mr. Glenn Bannister, took the presidency, did the Bahamas National Trust pass a resolution declaring that the development which was proposed for Clfton was definitely out of order and should not be allowed. And they went on, Mr. Speaker, to declare that Clfton should be made a national park. Mr. Speaker, at that time, I felt so elated that this statutory body that all of us relied on to say words such as that so many times before at that point, stood forward and say that they supported the cause to protect Clfton. But it was only, Mr. Speaker, after the wings of people like Mr. Larson and after the wings of people like Mrs. Buckner were clipped by the council, who was represented, Mr. Speaker, by international bodies from all over this world, from the Smithsonian and other universities. These people, Mr. Speaker, were being misled, taken down a path, thinking that everything was okay with Clfton, when in fact the executive management knew it wasn't. What was interesting also, Mr. Speaker, and this is the place to make the connections, is the then Ambassador for the Environment, my predecessor, Senator Holowesco. She is the mother-in-law to Mr. Larson. And Mr. Speaker, it is unfortunate that people would allow themselves to do such things so overtly and believe that people would not see. and worse, believed that people would not speak. This is not the time for cowards in this country, not when we are following the shoes and the footsteps of brave men and women who gave their life for us to still be here today. Not, Mr. Speaker, when it is a situation where our people would rely on the strength, broad shoulders of some of the leaders of our day. Mr. Speaker, I wish to address some issues that relates to tourism. And I wish to try to help to reshape or to shape the vision of the Clfton Authority. With it becoming, Mr. Speaker, a touristic destination unto itself, while we preserve our archaeological heritage as well as our environment. As I have stated here before, Mr. Speaker, I see both permanent archaeological excavation sites as well as a marine type facility, Mr. Speaker, which can be carefully structured as some kind of conservancy where scientists from all around the world can come and bid for the right to conduct research. In this area, Mr. Speaker, Bahamians and visitors alike would have the ability to access more than 2 miles of beach area without any question or problem. From a marketing point of view, Mr. Speaker, I already see African American tourists wanting to visit Clfton, to learn more about Clfton, to learn more about the gateway, Mr. Speaker. Clfton was one of the gateways of slaves being transported to the United States. They are hungry in the United States. The African American are hungry to understand and to appreciate the linkages which exist between what they are today and what they were then, and how they got to where they are today to be what they are today. Mr. Speaker, when we were at the height of the fight to save Clifton, we had a great situation where I was able to speak with and convince Mrs. Bev Smith, who was at the time a very known international star on the television channel BET, for her to form and structure a blue ribbon committee to help us, Mr. Speaker, deal with the issue of saving Clifton. You see, a part of our fight, Mr. Speaker, was that we needed help. The help which we felt was not forthcoming from the leaders of our country. So we thought that if we reached out to the leaders of the United States, where these companies came from, that perhaps, Mr. Speaker, we would have been able to convince them to make a determination there in the United States that such developers should not be allowed to do in the Bahamas that which they would not normally be allowed to do in the United States. And around that time, Mr. Speaker, there was a big development that was stopped in South Florida because they had found some Indian circle of some sort, and they were not allowed to build. And likewise, they would not have been allowed to build here if, in fact, it would have caused damage to ruins such as what they had in Florida. You see, Mr. Speaker, when we look at those kinds of issues which existed then, there was more than one front to make this fight to save Clifton on. And one of the fronts, Mr. Speaker, was, of course, in the United States. So we put out the call, and Mr. Speaker, Bear Smith pulled together a team of persons, at least 5 other people. Ms. Glenda Gill, she was a representative from the Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push Coalition. Ms. Sheila Fraser, she was a producer with BET. And we had also Prince Emmanuel Ben Yehuda, who was a spokesperson of the African Hebrew Israelites, a body of persons who went back and who understand more, maybe than most, the importance of being proud because you are African. These people, along with others, Mr. Speaker, came here. And ultimately, as we know, came also Mr. Kennedy, who assisted in bringing the fight that was going on locally to the minds of the persons internationally. It was highly successful. And in that, we had more than 400 vehicles came together and trekked all through this island, ending up at Clfton, where there we had a rally to talk about and to have one big move to show what Clfton was all about. And a part of the reason why this was necessary, Mr. Speaker, was because in this house it was stated, Code Smith, C.B. Morse and the rest of them, they don't have anybody following them. They have no one following them. We here in this house are the representative of the people. And so, Mr. Speaker, on a leap of faith, I stepped out and asked people to come and show your support. And Mr. Speaker, I was flabbergasted. And that is why I started off this presentation in truth, my belief in the awesomeness of God being behind the saving of Clifton and must be now behind this legislation. See, Mr. Speaker, if we for a moment step back to the statement that I read into this record by the Honorable Prime Minister Christie, who was then the opposition leader. Mr. Speaker, 2 years outside of the general election, he made that statement. That is a statement, Mr. Speaker, that could have been the end of Perry Gladstone Christie as leader of the Progressive Liberal Party, and could have been the end of any hope that the Progressive Liberal Party would be the government today. But, Mr. Speaker, as bold as that was, and he putting his political organization in potential jeopardy, he put himself on a foot-to-toe fight with Mr. Chapman, who thought that the statement, and he said it publicly, that the statement of Perry Christie was wrong. It sent chilling effect throughout the international community. Those were the games, Mr. Speaker, that people such as those developers were doing. But the Progressive Liberal Party prevailed. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the testament to what it is that we have here. Mr. Speaker, you know, when we think about it also, it is important for us to note that Clfton is a place which is well known for its historical importance as it relates to Junkerton. You know, I know that we had been talking quite a lot in the past 2 years about bleachers and the operation or the effectiveness of Junkerton on Bay Street, and it should be moved, and all these many different things that has been said. And Mr. Speaker, I can simply say that when we look at the fact that there are regulations, which I also table in front of this House today, and there is law that was passed in this House back in 1830, Mr. Speaker, and other kinds of records that we find, Mr. Speaker, in the books which have been put together and researched and as a part of the record of the National Archives, which shows, Mr. Speaker, that Clfton was one of the first places that recognized the importance of having Christmas Day and Boxing Day off. Mr. William Wiley was quite an interesting fellow, because he passed these regulations, Mr. Speaker, in 1815. 1815, these regulations of the Clfton plantation were passed, and it would be read, Mr. Speaker, the first week of January of every year, and the first week of July of every year, read out loud. And these are part for this house and the persons of this house to see. And I will go straight to one part of it and read it. This is what will be read out loud. Christmas Day and the day next before and after it are holidays, and half tasks only are to be set the people on Saturday. At Christmas, they are to be at liberty to go where they please, and they are to receive permission to go to town on Saturdays, provided that they have poultry, vegetables, or other articles to carry to market. But they are never to leave the plantations in rainy weather, or when the provisions or their provisions or grounds are out of order. And Mr. Speaker, these rules and regulations that were set out shows that there was a certain kind of coexistence between slave and master, which sort of turns on its head some of the belief which so many of us have about what slavery may have been and what it was all about. And in his own way, Mr. Speaker, Mr. William Wiley was indeed a man beyond his time. Mr. Speaker, the fight to save Clifton relates to the urgent need to create an environment and cultural heritage policy on general zoning issues on land development. When we think about the fact that we've had so many people come into this country who are not from here, who effectively were able to steal land, we can see the importance behind words of people such as Dr. C.R. Walker, who really points to us and tells us how important it is for us to safeguard our land, because it is, Mr. Speaker, as he says, important, very, very important to our identity, that when we allow foreign persons to come into your country and to take from you what you have, especially where it is at the expense of your culture, that it is not only your economic existence that is being threatened, but it is also your cultural and political lives as well. Mr. Speaker, this is so very important when we look today at the kind of commentary that was made even against me by one of the proposers who hope to build a pipeline from Ocean Key to Florida. Mr. Speaker, this gentleman questions publicly my integrity because, Mr. Speaker, I took a position which was well within my right to do, and said that I thought we should wait until certain things were done.
That's right.
And Mr. Speaker, I am very, very shocked and surprised, that
Absolutely sure.
Mr. Aaron Sampson of AES would, in the Nassau Guardian, Mr. Speaker, in the Nassau Guardian, and I want to read this because, Mr. Speaker, he was attacking one of the people's representatives. And he says, Mr. Speaker, I'm just taking it straight to where the issue is. Later on Thursday, this is the report, AES Project Director Aaron Sampson told the Guardian that Mr. Smith was obviously not reading the EIA documents and does not understand the extensive amount of control that the company has given Best Commission and the government through its environmental management plan. They will have all kinds of enforcement capabilities, but specifically in agreement with the government, we have agreed to penalty provisions for environmental compliance And he goes on and says, and I don't know what his, meaning me, don't know what his agenda is. Mr. Speaker, when I saw this, I was floored. I was knocked off my feet because I couldn't believe that this person who was being invited and entertained, similarly to Chapman, Light and Associates, that this person would say such a thing about someone to whom he had to present his project and proposals. That's like someone telling the Prime Minister that he was not reading a document, and if he said anything that was inconsistent with their position, that it is definitely that the Prime Minister had some other agenda other than doing his job. Mr. Speaker, I abhor that, and I speak strongly against that. I reserve my right to deal with Mr. Sampson from this platform that I have. And Mr. Speaker, people such as him do not belong in the Bahamas.
That's right.
And if his policy is a policy which is followed in his company, just like Chapman Light Associates, should not be allowed in this country. If he feels that he can question my integrity. I learned from Mr. David Bethel, late David Bethel, an attorney, before he died. He said, Keod.
What did he say? Tell us.
He said, Keod, a long time ago, in the 60s, I determined to have a practice on my own, and people started a whisper campaign against me, suggesting that I was doing some things untoward. And he told me, and this would have been maybe, Mr. Speaker, but a month and a half before he died. And he said, you know, Keod, if I had known better, I would have challenged them then, dropped everything, and deal with them then, because that stuck on me and stayed with me for all of my professional career. And it hampered my development. That's what David Bethel told me. And then David Bethel said to me, he said, Keod, I'll tell you just one thing. My advice to you as an old lawyer is that if ever anyone calls your integrity into question, and especially if you believe that they are wrong, do not ever let the matter pass, because if it does, it will stick on you for life. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, I take advantage of my privilege, my right, and everything to speak directly to this person who questions my integrity. Luckily for him, it is not up to me to determine what happens with his proposal. If it was because of his transgression, I would tell him to turn away and go and come back no more. We cannot allow this kind of thing to happen. We cannot allow this to happen. And Mr. Speaker, I put all of what I am on the line to call him out. This kind of thing, Mr. Speaker, cannot happen in this country. It happened back in 1999 when Mr. Chapman, spoke ill of the Prime Minister that we have today. He spoke ill of me, and my colleagues said that we were a tyrannical minority. He is gone. He's no longer here.
You said him out, right?
That's right. I told him he had to leave, and he did. And it wasn't because, Mr. Speaker, because he wanted to leave. He left because he had no other choice. Because even the government of that day, Mr. Speaker, could not protect him. And Mr. Speaker, I think I can say that the Progressive Labour Party is favorable. It's favorable to all good and sensible investors who come to this country. And they would want to have all good people to come here. Those persons who are, I would say, desirable foreign investors. An undesirable foreign investor, Mr. Speaker, are those persons whom I could never and will never support being here. Will never support being here. Undesirable investors, Mr. Speaker, in my view, are those persons who do not support the concept of democracy, who disrespect any and all aspects of Bahamian life and its people, who take overt stands or otherwise intermeddles in the internal politics of our country, who seek, Mr. Speaker, to incite Bahamian people to hate or to otherwise hold other Bahamian people in public odium. Simply put, these are people who seek to divide and conquer. Mr. Speaker, these are also persons who perpetuate any kind of fraud in making their proposals before this country and before this government. People like that, Mr. Speaker, I will lose all that I have to get rid of those people. And I stand very publicly, unashamedly, without any hesitation to say, such as they do not venture to come into our land, because they are not welcome by me. And Mr. Speaker, we have to not encourage these kind of people to do these things. And if the people of AES thought that Keod Smith was going to simply stand by and let those missiles be shot at him, so they say, it ain't so. That's right. And well, I ain't too sure I'm short in stature, but I will say one thing, that I am not a pushover. And it ain't never ever gonna happen. I ain't gonna pick no fight, but I ain't gonna run either.
You ain't never scared. You ain't never scared.
Never scared.
Never back down.
The only thing I'm scared about is what I can't see, and that's ghosts. That's the only thing I'm scared about. Mr. Speaker, as I get near to the end of my contribution, of course we are here to talk about this bill. And, the bill, in my view, is a very good bill. It does have a number of points that needs to be looked at for strengthening the bill so that it can, in fact, achieve the intention that I have set out here today, and so that it can achieve the intention which I know the Progressive Liberal Party in Cabinet, certainly Perry Gladstone Christie now as our Honourable Prime Minister, certainly then as the Leader of the Opposition had in his contemplation. We share the same view, and I believe in the presentation of the mover of this bill, the Honourable Attorney General, that I believe that that intention also is the same. And in short, the intention is that the 208 acres of land plus any other land comprising and making up the Clfton heritage will not be in any part, in any portion, and certainly not completely disposed of in any form. In other words, it will not be sold. It will not be encumbered. It will not be used to lease, to borrow, to mortgage, to collateralize anything. This land is our property, the Bahamian people property, free and clear, never, ever, ever to be disposed of. That, Mr. Speaker, is what I fought for, what I lost a lot of money for, what I, Mr. Speaker, got a lot of blows for, which, Mr. Speaker, I still getting blows for. But I will continue to get blows just to be sure that that land is protected. It is my duty, it is maybe my destiny, that that is what I am supposed to be about. Mr. Speaker, if it is also that we are to do what we have to do at this stage of this process, I would wish to encourage as soon as is possible the findings of the committee that is to deal with how the property is to be paid for to be made public, so that we could fully and carefully determine that our people would really be going down the right path. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that I would want to be able to say from my perch right here today to encourage every single Bahamian, every single person, expatriate, that may live in this island, that as far as they are able to, that they should contribute grants, contribute time, contribute whatever other kind of resources they can to ensure that the people who are entitled to be paid are in fact paid, so that the legal process, Mr. Speaker, is carried through. And we have to be careful and mindful to ensure that any person we have coming in for any purpose connected with Clfton understand that the policy which we in the Bahamas have to put in place is a policy of how to use, Mr. Speaker, our resources. And that they're not to come in to take advantage of what we may have, and certainly not to take advantage, Mr. Speaker, of any deficiencies we may have just because there is a deficiency. And Mr. Speaker, you know, I note that we have had a lot of report over the past couple of days in the press about a movie company who is shooting the movie Into the Blue, who apparently, Mr. Speaker, may have placed a sunken plane that they need for their shoot over the reef or somewhere near the reef, where there may be either damage being done or damage might be done. Mr. Speaker, I can tell this House as a matter of report that the Best Commission under my chairmanship and leadership made it very clear in writing over my signature, Mr. Speaker, over my signature, that the plane in question was not supposed to be in any close proximity to a living, live reef system. Mr. Speaker, I was assured by persons from other agencies of the government that this was going to be assured. Mr. Speaker, naturally I was abhorred by the photograph which I saw, because the photograph, Mr. Speaker, which I did see, if I understand it correctly, does show that a part of the wing of that aircraft is extended over the living reef. Mr. Speaker, I can tell this House and I can tell the Bahamian people that that fact of where that plane is situated has never been approved by me. I speak for the Best Commission, only me. And Mr. Speaker, I have a contract that talks about what it is I am and what it is I do. I think, Mr. Speaker, I have problems when people from outside of the country come and find weaklings who are prepared to roll over and play stupid about what it is we need to safeguard and protect. And Mr. Speaker, this is no joke. This is no joke. Because if a letter was sent out to the people involved saying you are to do or not to do a thing, you would have thought that if they in fact were going to do what you say they can't do, that at least they would write back to you. I have no letter, Mr. Speaker, in my possession, and as far as I'm aware, the last time I was at my office, in that office, from those people suggesting that they intended to proceed with what I said they could not do. Now, mind you, Mr. Speaker, statutorily I recognize that it is the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, the Department of Fisheries, that have the statutory power to issue permits. But if, under heads of agreement, Mr. Speaker, people subject themselves to the expertise of the Best Commission and to what is structured by virtue of the policy that exists, then, Mr. Speaker, we have a problem when things such as what is reported is being reported. And I recognize, Mr. Speaker, that you will have personalities that will disagree. And so I'm not going to get into the argument that seemed to be going between one dive shop against the other dive shop and the others. I will deal with the facts. The facts are, or the fact is, that plane is where I said it shouldn't and couldn't be. And so, Mr. Speaker, I would call from this position that I stand, for those persons to indicate very clearly to me that what I think I see is not what is. And the only way that they can convince me, unfortunately, I have a flu, Mr. Speaker. Otherwise, in my newfound ability to dive, I would have dove. But, I've been told one of the first things is if you have a flu or cold, you shouldn't dive. And so I can't. Unfortunately, I can't dive at this moment because I would have been there to check it myself. But, Mr. Speaker, that is not allowed. And persons coming in, you see, Mr. Speaker, when we have resources such as our reefs, the reason why they decided to come here to shoot that movie is, Mr. Speaker, because of the beautiful reef system and waters we have. And if they were to put themselves in the position that they can walk on the reef, or break the reef, or, Mr. Speaker, attach guide wires into the reef, or put any kind of other contraptions on top of a living coral reef to secure a plane, just so they can shoot a movie, then, Mr. Speaker, if they did that, there will not be any more space or any more purpose, reason for some other movie company to come here to do a similar thing. And so we have to develop the kind of environment policy which we need so that everybody understands the parameters within which we're working. I call on the people who are shooting the movie Into the Blue to cease and desist immediately so that we can understand, so that I am able to explain by my contract to the parties I need to explain to what is in fact happening, and that they have the requisite authority to do what they're doing. And Mr. Speaker, when it all comes down to it, I take my position, my job seriously, very seriously. And if it is that
my learned friend, not learned, no, I take good advice. Because I just want to speak in the record.
Mr. Speaker, I also know that, we have people who utilize our natural resources very, very willfully in ways, Mr. Speaker, that is not always conducive to sustainability.
What do you got?
And what is interesting, Mr. Speaker, is that right now the Ministry of Health and Environment Services, as was pressed for by the Best Commission through the voice of the Minister of Foreign Affairs in August of 2000, we were able, Mr. Speaker, I ain't saying nothing bad with you, man. We in the Bahamas, Mr. Speaker, were able to cause the preparatory meeting for the sustainable development which is to happen in Mauritius later on this year to be held here. And as you are aware, I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, we have hundreds and hundreds of people that are now here. My learned colleague, the Foreign Affairs Minister, is saying that he did introduce me to President Chavez of Venezuela. And that is correct. I would like to report to him publicly that I did have an opportunity to further speak with President Chavez in Cuba some months ago. And, I don't know if my solid and very firm position on certain things is going to be even more and more influenced by virtue of my newfound friends. So I don't know. I don't know, Mr. Speaker. I don't know if the minister wishes to continue to make it known who he introduced me to from time to time. But, Mr. Speaker, we are able to have that function here because of the efforts of environmental scientists and experts, and of course other good thinking members of our government, to see the need to have it here. And I just want to wrap up by saying, Mr. Speaker, that the Bahamas has been it's been a long time that we have been plagued with having to learn about our history and learn our history. from other people from other countries, and learn about other countries at the expense of learning our own. And Mr. Speaker, it is also known that because of the kind of colonization and imperialization that happened of our people over the many, many years, as was indicated earlier by my learned colleagues, the Minister of Michael and the Member of Parliament from Elizabeth, that we developed a very Eurocentric way of thinking. Clfton, Mr. Speaker, allows us the opportunity to be able to swing or begin to swing the pendulum back somewhere to the center, so that we can begin to be proud about who we are as Africans. And for those who are not Africans, for being proud to be able to live in harmony in a stable, non-violent country with people of African background who constitute the majority. Mr. Speaker, we all have something to be thankful for. Yes. Because so many countries, Zimbabwe is one of them, who see a totally different situation. Uganda was one of them many years ago that saw a totally different situation. South Africa was one that saw a totally different situation for a time. Mr. Speaker, we all have something to be grateful and thankful about. And I would encourage my colleagues, I would encourage the people and constituents of Mount Moriah to be bold about who they are, to be proud about who they are, to be unashamed about who they are as Africans. Because, Mr. Speaker, when it all comes down to it, no matter how much they try, the cradle of civilization is still in Africa. The oldest antiquities are still in Africa. Artifacts and remains are still in Africa. Our Savior and Lord is still African. Still African, Mr. Speaker. Our Savior and Lord, Yeshua, Jesus Christ, is still African. He is one race. But he stands for all people. We should not be ashamed to say that he was a black man like me. He was. And so, Mr. Speaker, our African heritage is so important to us all. And Clfton allows us to be able to stand to that, Mr. Speaker. And I will forever stand to what I believe in. And for those of you here or those elsewhere who might not have been able to get the message or understand the nature of my contribution, I'm sure that you would all agree that in order for one to move forward, we must first know from whence we came. History, Mr. Speaker, the true and complete history, allows this kind of progress to happen. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, I hope never again to have to stand up in Rawson Square and shout, "Take a stand, save our land" at Clfton. Mr. Speaker, subject to my comments that I've made, I support this bill. Mr. Speaker, I wish to tender these documents as I've indicated to you and to have them all tabled.
Order the documents are brought up. Order the documents to lie on the table of the House.
That's all I need.
As many